Well, now that I'm off mute, I'd like to welcome everybody to our What Do We Learn webinar, Document Management in Salesforce and Creating that Single Source of Truth. I'm Betsy. I'm a business architect with the Bluefish Group. I'm also joined today with Gary, who's one of our technical architects, also at Bluefish, as well as Michael, who is a channel account sales manager with M-Files. And I'd like to thank the gentleman for joining me today. So we have about 45 minutes set aside for today with a question and answer section at the end. If you have any questions as we go through our demo and discussion, please drop it into the Q&A window. We may not be able to answer all of your questions today. And if we're not able to get to yours, we will definitely follow up with you after the webinar. All right? Okay, so cloud applications can be found throughout most organizations. One of the applications that we see a lot, including our own company, is Salesforce. Salesforce is used for many different purposes, from customer relationship management to issue management and case management, and the list goes on. One feature that Salesforce offers is the ability to attach documents. And while Salesforce offers that functionality, we have seen a number of pain points. And while this list is not an exhaustive list of all the pain points that you may experience, this is what we tend to hear a lot. And one of the biggest pain points is not having that single source of truth for documents. When you have users who do not have access to Salesforce, what we see happen, and I know I've done it myself, is that multiple versions of the same document start to get created because they don't have access, so I create my own little version. The storage of these documents can be all over the place, including email and various file systems. And with all these different versions, it's really hard to know what the correct version of it happens to be. So what is the solution? Integrate your cloud application with a true document management system. And while we believe this is a generically very good advice, today we're going to talk a lot more about one of our favorite ECM platforms, M-Files, that happens to provide an integration with Salesforce. So Michael, what other pain points have you heard that led M-Files to invest in the development of an integration with Salesforce?
Great question, Betsy. So I would say overall, I mean, these four are pretty big ones, but I would say in general, just a lack of efficiency from employees and knowledge-based workers. So we did a lot of independent studies with, analysts like Gartner, Nucleus Research, AIM. And what we found is about 52% of organizations use 4 or more systems to manage various content. And about 54% of those organizations, I would say, manage their information in a content management solution that's not connected to those other lines of business. So if you can imagine from a user standpoint, how much information is siloed and how much impact it has from a user standpoint of how they access this information. So it's one of the reasons why we created this integration, is to kind of keep information flowing. And you can kind of imagine these types of content systems can include email, and in this case, it's including Salesforce. So just think of that single source solution for all of your information.
Wow, that's incredible. Some of the numbers that you have stated, I'm just kind of blown away by those numbers. So today we'd like to spend the bulk of our time really kind of digging in to this example integration with Salesforce and M-Files. And so I'd like to turn it over to Gary. And Gary, can you show us how this integration works?
Sure, thanks, Betsy. And as Betsy mentioned, we're going to spend most of our time in the rest of the demo today working in the applications themselves. So I'm going to move over Salesforce here and start. And we're going to focus on basically 3 major areas of this integration today. First off, we're going to show how M-Files can pull and utilize data from Salesforce in the application. And this includes possibilities of a one-way or a read-only integration where it's just pulling data, as well as a 2-way integration where M-Files can actually write back to Salesforce. And then we're going to show M-Files' newest integration with Salesforce, which is the embedded UI that's supported within the Lightning Salesforce application. And you can work directly in Salesforce, but still utilize documents in mFiles. And then lastly, I am going to highlight that we will still show the original Classic plugin. There is a plugin for Classic as well, and how it can also be utilized from Salesforce to work with mFiles documents. We know that some organizations are not yet able to move away from Classic and still use Classic today. So we want to highlight that integration as well. Now, before I go over to mFiles, I want to kind of just show our data in Salesforce. This is just a pretty typical dev sandbox. And so we have some account data here. Most of these are kind of the demo data you see with any sandbox environment. We have some accounts. I have contacts. Some cases. And a couple other things like leads and opportunities. And we're going to show this over in Salesforce to start, and then we'll walk over to mFiles. And let me show you, let's move over to mFiles, and we're going to see the data over there. This is the mFiles client, and right now I'm showing the user client. One of the things I'll do today briefly is also show the mFiles admin client. And that's really only used by administrators, developers, and maybe IT managers. But I want to highlight that later as well because it shows some of the ease of configuration with creating your documents and properties in mFiles. I'm going to kind of do a quick demo or run through of some of the features of the user client. However, before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about mFiles features. I mean, mFiles is an enterprise content management system, and like most ECMs, it has many of the usual features you'd expect out of an ECM. It does versioning, it has version history. You can revert to older versions when needed. You can see here we have metadata or properties on every document to help classify and organize your data. It supports creating workflows, document previews, and obviously there's security. Right now these are open to all users, but it does support utilizing access control lists to control exactly who can see and use and update documents, and many other features. mFiles also provides robust search capabilities, including a quick search that easily search through documents and their metadata, as well as advanced search capabilities where you can search against specific properties within mFiles. Now, one unique thing, design of mFiles, it's different than a lot of other content management systems. We're going to see things that look like folders today, but in reality, there are no folders in mFiles. So unlike a file system where you might drop files into a folder, you really don't have a folder in mFiles. All of the data is classified by the properties. And so we utilize what's called views. And views are grouped basically by properties. And you can have multiple levels. And why does this matter? Well, if you have a bunch of different views, you have many different ways to get at the documents that you need to use. And users can actually determine what works best for them. And so we use the phrase a lot of times, one document, many views. There may be a document in the system and you may have several ways to get at it, depending on how your day-to-day operations go. Now, mFiles also provides not only a Salesforce integration, but an Outlook integration as well. And we're not showing that today, but I want to mention it briefly because much like the Salesforce integration, the Outlook integration allows users to work from that application and access mFiles from there. And so really the point of that is you can work where you're most comfortable and where you normally would work. You have the Outlook integration, you can work from Outlook. If you prefer to use the mFiles client, you can work there. If you prefer to stay in Salesforce, you can work from there. So if we look at the client application, I want to walk through it real quickly just so you have an idea of what all these views are. It's really designed to allow users to immediately see what they need to act on and what they need to work with. So there's a recently accessed document list here, and this view shows basically anything that the user has touched in order of last time they accessed it. And it allows them to quickly pick up where they left off. If I click on a document here, you can see we have metadata on each of these documents. All these properties are set, and these help organize your documents. And again, these metadata properties can be used for groupings and views to help you get to your get to your documents. There's also a preview capability where you can actually see the document data. And I can do the usual things like checking out a document to work on it, adding to a workflow, maybe doing a simple assignment to somebody, and all the other features you expect, including version history, where I can walk back through the history of the document to see what changes have been made. Now, there are a couple other panels here, and we're not going to really talk about today, but I kind of want to highlight them because they're nice features to highlight, even if we won't be using them. One is the assign to me. We're talking about workflow briefly. This allows users to immediately see any kind of workflow tasks that have been delivered to them that they need to work on. And then checked out to me would highlight any documents that a user has locked to currently work on. And so it's a nice thing to have because you don't want them to have them locked out indefinitely when they're working on them. And so it's shown here. There's also a feature where you can pin documents. So if you're using a bunch of documents, you can just pin them to the board here, and they're available for easy access. Now, I'm going to talk a lot today about documents, classes, and objects. And so I want to kind of define those just a little bit. Documents are kind of obvious, but objects may not be. And an object, it basically does, in mFiles, is a collection of data and properties. And it does not have to have a document attached to it. You can have all sorts of objects. And some examples of that might be an object to represent something like an account or a project or a case. And in the world of mFiles, you can link objects together. And this is hugely important because it actually means we can drive views within mFiles by using these linked objects. And we're going to highlight this today in our demo with Salesforce. And real quick, I'm just going to jump to one of our documents. Some of these are actual just properties set on the document, but anywhere where you see a little arrow here, this is actually a linked object. And if I go to that object, I can actually see all of the information that is linked to that object. And so I can very quickly see all the documents that are attached to this account, for example. And so this is very powerful. And again, you can use this for grouping and reviews. So we control the data that's brought over from Salesforce, and we create objects from Salesforce. And we've created a couple of views to highlight this. This data is actually synchronized by mFiles behind the scenes, so users don't have to create any of these things. And in our environment, we have created, I'm going to open this up. This is a view here, and this actually has all of the objects that we've brought over from Salesforce. And so we've synchronized accounts, cases, contacts, events, leads, and opportunities. And if I open up accounts, you can see this list looks very similar to what I showed you at the beginning of my talk when I showed you the Salesforce data. If I go into contacts, I can see all this here. And so when you're using these, one of the really nice things is if I open up an account, I can actually see not only the data is brought over, but all the linkages are brought over as well. And so you can see when the data was synchronized, it linked the cases to the right account, it linked the contact to the right account, and all the I mentioned earlier, the documents. And so many times you may actually be working in mFiles and never need to leave because this data is synchronized and you can see what's been brought over. And you may be able to work directly in mFiles without having to go refer to anything in Salesforce. So it's very powerful integration. And today we're showing basically some standard Salesforce objects and tables that are synchronized, but it's also possible to do your own integrations with custom tables as well. You just need to define the mappings there. So it's very powerful. And I mentioned, I'm showing these views here, and I mentioned, we synchronize with Salesforce. And before I move over to the actual Salesforce side of things, I do want to highlight real quickly the mFiles admin tool. This tool is, again, only really used by people that are modifying the underlying mFiles system. But it's very powerful and also very well organized and allows you to do many things through configuration that you might normally have to do through customization or coding or things like that. We've defined in our vault an account object, a case object, contact, and event, lead, and opportunity. All of these are objects that are linked to Salesforce and are populated by data from Salesforce coming over. And this is a really elegant hierarchical view, and it allows you to quickly see all the objects, classes, and properties that are set up in your Vault system. So even though we're not going to dig into this very much today, I did want to highlight this because it's very useful and allows you to get working really quickly when you're first setting up a Vault application. So I want to jump over and then start showing this in Salesforce. And one of the things we're going to do, I'm going to go back and forth a little bit between mFiles and Salesforce to kind of show you that what we're seeing in Salesforce is very similar to what is set up in mFiles. And the power of that is it doesn't really necessarily matter where you're working. You can go back, you can work wherever you're most comfortable. So I'm going to open this up here. And then we're going to go over to Salesforce. The first thing I'm going to show you is the Lightning integration. And this is the newest, and really because it's embedded, is probably the most convenient for Salesforce users because they don't ever have to leave. They can work in the system. Now, I've set up on the accounts page, I've customized it. I'm going to jump into one of my accounts. We've set up, I edited the page and from the App Exchange, installed the plugin, the embedded UI application. And you can see down here, I've added it to the bottom of the page. Now, this is all driven by views. When you add an embedded UI into the page, you tell it what view to utilize. And there's a couple ways I'm going to show you how you might use this. The first way is basically when you launch the view, you tell it the ID of the page you're on. So for example, I'm in this account, and now I'm only going to see the documents that are related to this account. Now in my view, to make it kind of more interesting, I added another layer of grouping by the class of the document. And so you don't have to have a flat structure here. It's totally possible to have as many nested groupings as you need. In our case, we're just doing account and then the actual class of the document. So if I open this up, I can see the documents for this account only. And if I click on one, I can actually get a preview of it and see the metadata here. Now, this is where I'm going to say, I'm going to jump back over to mFiles real quick and show you. This is exactly similar to what you would work with in mFiles. So go into mFiles and go into the account, and go into the contract. These are the same documents, and you can see the metadata. And so it doesn't matter if I'm in Salesforce or if I'm in mFiles, I can work with the documents in a very similar way. A couple of things to note, on these contracts, we are automatically also setting up a workflow. It's kind of part of the example sandbox data for the vault. And so you can definitely do that when you add a document into Salesforce. If it's set to automatically add it, put it in a workflow, it'll do that behind the scenes. Doesn't matter if you're in Salesforce or if you're in mFiles. Now, the other thing I want to show, this is pretty standard. You can attach documents to an account pretty easily. But the fact that it's organized and nested is very powerful, and the fact that your source of truth is actually in mFiles is very powerful. But there's other things you can do with these views. Now, let's imagine that you have documents you want to get to from an account, but they're basically across all accounts. There may be resources and things like that. So I customized the page to have a new tab here called Resource Material, and this points at a view, but this view has no ID constraint. It just says load everything up into the screen here from this view. And so if you have documents, for example, that are maybe like operating procedures or just like a battle card here for talking to different accounts about products, you can basically provide that across all accounts. And so I'm going to show you real quick. If I jump to a different account, the documents here are obviously different because these are related to the Bluefish account. And so you can see, this view is constrained by the account that this is related to. However, if I go to Resource Material, now I'm seeing the same documents I saw before because this is a general view. And to do the back and forth here, I'm going to go back to mFiles real quick. And this is my view here where I set this up. Now, again, we're showing this in Salesforce and mFiles today. If you also had an Outlook integration, it would be driven by views as well. And so, again, the users can work where they're comfortable and stay in the applications they're most comfortable with, and still have a single source of truth where the data is actually stored in mFiles. Now, I've showed this. I'm going to actually work with some documents in a moment. But before I do that, I actually want to jump over real quick over to Classic and just show the Classic integration, and that it still exists, and you can put it in Classic pages. So let me jump to Classic. So in the Classic Salesforce integration, you have a plugin, Visualforce, that you install. It works a little bit differently. It's not an embedded UI. It does integrate with the mFiles application. But it's very similar in that it spawns a view and it passes the ID. So if I open up the show documents here, it's going to create a view window from InFiles, and I'm still going to see the same documents that I saw in the embedded UI with Lightning. However, it does utilize launching the InFiles client application. And so both of these are supported, and in this environment, I have them running in both places. So if I have some Lightning pages with the embedded UI, and I have some classic pages with the original classic plugin. Now let's work with some documents real quick, just to give you kind of an idea. And we won't dig in too far on these, but I do kind of want to show you some of the power of working with the documents with the Salesforce integration. So you can do a couple of things. I'll do a simple use case, and I'm going to jump back and forth. Imagine a scenario. This is a user. There's a user working in Salesforce, and there's a different user working in InFiles. And if I need to come in as a Salesforce user and I need to make some updates to this contract, if we right-click, notice I can check the document out. I can download it. I can actually, if I had Office installed on my server here, I can show it, show the integration there. And you can edit the documents. And you can also replace the binary document with a new version if needed. So I'm actually going to check this out from Salesforce. At that point, I can make changes to this and know that nobody else can be modifying it while I'm doing it. But I want to show you now as this is a different user actually in InFiles. If I go over to, well, I can actually see the document here because I've recently accessed it. You can see it has a red kind of stop sign or no entry because it's been locked out. And the nice thing is you can actually see who has checked it out and when. And so if you need to track them down for some reason, you can. But right now I can modify this document over in Salesforce. So I'm going to quickly go do that. And I'm just going to change the date. Let's do that. So I've updated the document date from Salesforce. And over here, let me check it back in. It's not making no changes. You can see now it's unlocked. Now I'm at version 5, and you can see the last modified time, and then my date's been updated. And so I didn't have to leave Salesforce at all to modify the metadata or add documents or anything like that. I could just work from where I'm most comfortable. If I go to version history here, I could actually look back and see all the changes that have been made and look at the metadata for each version. And again, you can roll back if needed to a previous version. So now I've shown kind of editing an existing document, but let's add a new document with Salesforce. So I'm going to go into my demo files here and just grab a document. I'm going to just drag it in. And I want to highlight a couple of things. This metadata card starts you off basically classifying the document information. Obviously, metadata is important in files because without it, we don't really know how to organize how we view documents through the views. But what's happened here, I've dropped this document underneath the contract class, underneath the account. And so InFiles will automatically fill in as much metadata as it can based on what it knows based on where you are. So what that means is from the contract view, it's going to say, oh, you're in the contract view. I'm going to set the class to contract. And you're in this Burlington account. So I'm going to go ahead and set this data. And the further or more specific you are, the more in the view, the more data it can populate. So this is extremely powerful, and it can save a huge amount of time. And not only save time, it also improves accuracy. You don't have to worry about a user picking the right account or the right class. All they have to do is drag it into the view. All that data is going to be pre-populated, and then they can set whatever remaining fields are needed. Just real quick, a highlight, anything with a star is required metadata. Everything else is optional. So I can just go ahead and create this. And then over in InFiles, you can see I've just added it here. Now on the InFiles side, it's very similar. If I go into InFiles and drag a document in, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to say, hey, I know you're in a view where the class is a contract, and I know that the account is Burlington, so I'm going to go ahead and pre-populate that data, and that way you don't have to worry about it. It's already done. And again, for this class, we've also set up a rule that, hey, everything that gets created for this class gets put on a workflow. That's not required at all, but it allows you to easily make sure that everything goes on a workflow. And you can attach documents manually to a workflow, but this makes sure that anything that is created gets assigned and starts to go through the process. I'm gonna go ahead and just check this one in. So we've shown viewing documents, we've shown editing documents, we've shown adding documents from both mFiles and Salesforce. And you can see on both sides that the view-driven architecture of mFiles is very powerful because it allows you in the Salesforce side to only show specific documents for a given page, or to allow a view where you have multiple documents across many of accounts or a case or whatever. The last thing I want to talk about today, I talked about earlier one-way versus two-way sync. And when you set up an integration with Salesforce, you can actually tell it that you set it up such that it can write back to Salesforce. And what that means is maybe I need to create new accounts or contacts or cases, and I don't want to leave mFiles. Well, if you set up a two-way integration, you don't have to. So I'm going to go through, I'm not going to actually create a contact, but I can show you what it would look like. If I create contact, it's going to bring up a screen, and notice it alerted me here. And it says confirm autofill. And this is a really cool feature in mFiles that helps save time. Again, we showed about time saving, adding metadata, auto-populating metadata from where you are in a view. This is another time saving feature. When I add this contact, it sees where I'm at and says, oh, you're working on creating a contact and you're in a Burlington view. So I'm going to pre-populate that data. And in addition, if there's any common fields, owner is common to contact and it's common to account, I'm going to ask if you want to auto-populate it. Now, this is just one field, but you can set this up to actually write quite a few fields if you set up the map. So if I say yes, it's going to set this data automatically. Now, notice again, it automatically set the Salesforce account for me. I don't have to even do that. And so some of this data has already been created without me having to do anything. And so again, this increases speed, this increases accuracy. It's a great feature. And with only one copy, it doesn't look as powerful as like a bunch, but you can set up many mappings and write over several fields. So I wanted to highlight, the power of the sort of the two-way integration, where you can set up mFiles to be able to write back to Salesforce. I'm going to cancel this. And so in conclusion, this has just been a really high-level overview, and we kind of showed you 4 different things today. We showed you the mFiles user client. We showed you the mFiles admin client, where you can quickly create the structure you need for your mFiles vault. We showed you Salesforce Lightning, where you can view and edit and add documents. We showed the classic plugin, where you're able to basically do the same thing, but it's driven by launching views within the mFiles client. And the benefit, and again, all of these documents are stored in mFiles, so you have a single source of truth. You don't have to worry about multiple copies of things and where something might live. All the documents live in mFiles, and you can view them for whatever application you're most comfortable with. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to Betsy now. She's going to talk about some of the lessons learned we had from a recent implementation where we did integrate mFiles with Salesforce.
Thank you, Gary. I'm always amazed every time I see this integration at work, just how powerful it can be. And it really looks like that you can be in whatever tool you're most comfortable with. So, as we saw during Gary's demo, along with solving a number of those pain points that we previously mentioned, there's a number of benefits to using an ECM solution as well. So yeah, Gary, can you go to the next slide there?
Yeah, let me jump in.
All right. So, obviously some of the benefits that we have shown you and even talked a little bit about include real-time collaboration, versioning of documents, document control, which means you can have security on who can see what documents, that sort of thing. Michael, what else would you like to add as additional benefits of using an enterprise content management tool?
Yeah, Betsy, I would say that Gary did a great job with the amount of time we had to show some of the benefits and value propositions of this integration. There's so much more there that we could show and talk about. But I would say something that's probably not quantifiable in a demo, but that we've seen in a lot of integrations with organizations that have Salesforce and M-Files is just being able to reduce the cost of Salesforce from an organization standpoint. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of companies that are buying Salesforce licenses for users that just need to consume Salesforce information. So imagine somebody needs access to a contact record or an opportunity or maybe a document that's saved in Salesforce, but it's not necessarily a sales employee. You can imagine how many of those users are possibly being able to access that information now through the integration through M-Files, which is a lot less expensive. So you can imagine the impact it has from an organization standpoint in terms of saving money. The other thing I would say is just having the repository agnostic approach to content management and really just saying, if you want access to the content, it doesn't matter if you prefer a Salesforce UI or M-Files UI, you can access that content however you feel most comfortable. So from a user adoption standpoint, you can imagine how it makes it easier for users to kind of work the way that they want to work and really kind of like the tool that they're using, because to the user, it's seamless, right? So I would say those two things are probably something you don't necessarily would be able to see in a demonstration, but is something we've seen out in the wild.
All right, awesome, thank you. And so, Gary just mentioned that we've got some lessons learned from some of our recent implementations. And so I'd like to talk through some of those. Gary, if you could go to the next slide, please. So first off, let me set the scene. With one of our most recent implementations, it also required us to import a number of their existing files. And when I say a number, it's probably hundreds of thousands of files from an existing file system into M-Files. But as I'm sure many of you know, working on projects, never everything doesn't go to plan. So some of our lessons learned here, first off, really try to make sure that you understand what fields in Salesforce you want to sync back to M-Files and understand the use cases for those. You don't necessarily want to sync every file or every field, but you want to make sure that you're doing what makes the most logical sense. We experienced where we didn't necessarily do a good enough job trying to understand all of the use cases. And what happened was, as we got into this implementation with this particular customer, their requirements changed, and then we had to go back and do rework. And so that was a painful lesson for us to do, to have to kind of go back and do some rework with some previous groups of files that we had already imported into the tool. And speaking of that, all right, our second lesson learned is really trying to ensure that when you have code complete or basically means, or code freeze essentially really means both M-Files and Salesforce. So we were getting ready for our large import. We had everything tested. We'd had it signed off. We went through our user acceptance testing. We froze the code on the M-File side, but we didn't reach out to the Salesforce team to make sure that they weren't making any changes as well. So here we go with our import, and what happens? Well, they had made a change to some of the fields and it messed up our import. In fact, to the point where we actually had to back out and make the adjustments on our side, and then had to re-import several weeks later because of it threw us back into yet another round of testing. But on a more positive note, one of the things that we actually also did was we created what we called a guided tour. So each group of users that we were bringing over, we had its little guided tour with them to kind of show them what their files look like in the systems and how they would be able to go back and forth between Salesforce and M-Files, and how, just what it was going to look like and how they could do things. It wasn't training, right? It was just more like kind of like a demo in a way, kind of like what we just went through. But what it did is it really helped generate a lot of interest and excitement about the functionality that was headed their way. And I would say the last lesson learned was to make sure that your training is just in time. With one of our customers, they actually wanted to have training pretty early in our overall project cycle. And what happened there was Well, by the time we actually got to them and here's your files and we're importing them and now it's time for you to go and use the tool, they'd forgotten everything, right? They just they didn't remember how to use that functionality. So, while just-in-time training is obviously something that, is always a best practice, it bears repeating every now and then to make sure that we don't forget things like that.
Hey, Betsy,
So
can
far,
I
we talked a lot about the current integration between mFiles and Salesforce, but I'm wondering, where are we headed? Michael, can you share with us what maybe the future of this integration tends to look like?
Sure. So to kind of look back at how this was all kind of created, the integration started off as a two-way sync to be able to bring in data objects and documents from Salesforce. Then evolved into having a tab in Classic Web to what you actually saw today with the embedded UI with Gary's demo, and really just the idea of kind of pushing forward that repository agnostic approach and making the user experience seamless. So what we're actually doing is taking that embedded UI and making feature parity to our desktop client, which has a lot of rich features that the web client doesn't have access to, and really just improving what you're able to do with the integration. But I would say there's a lot of things on the roadmap, but I would say the most probably impressive thing that is my favorite topic is just AI. I feel like there's so much potential with AI. We have a very rich AI component of our desktop client that we weren't able to show today, but what it does is really enhances user experience by kind of taking a lot of the mundane task of like data tagging or data input, and really kind of using the AI to leverage by reading contents of what the document is, looking at other documents in your system to kind of match that with something very similar. So if you bring in a proposal, if it looks like a proposal, the AI is going to know that, hey, this looks just like a proposal. Is it a proposal for this particular client? So a lot of sophisticated stuff to really kind of eliminate the manual data entry that a user has to do day to day, and really kind of improving the speed and the quality of the information that you're tagging. Because Gary had mentioned that, what we're trying to do is eliminate somebody going in and mislabeling something in a metadata-driven solution. So I would say that's probably the most, exciting thing that we're doing.
Yeah,
And I always try to show that in demonstrations as well.
cool. So kind of like if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, it might be a duck.
Exactly.
All right, awesome.
Hey, Betsy, real quick, I was going to mention on the lessons learned when I was talking about all the different ways you might use Salesforce fields. Like number one on your list is understanding all the fields you want to sync. And I think as you initially linking objects is really neat, and then you realize oh wait, I can auto populate. We need to pull over more fields because this is great. And so and then you start, and then you're like, oh, I don't have to leave mFiles if I bring over most of this data. I can look at it in mFiles. I want to bring over more. And so there's definitely an iterative process there as we sort of started to not just see, but also really utilize some of the features like auto population through views and through the linked objects is really powerful. It does save a lot of time, and users don't want to manually enter metadata on everything. And accuracy and speed is improvement is really important. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that because that was definitely started out with a couple of fields in some of the custom tables, and then we're like, oh gosh, we want to have a bunch more of this data because we can really utilize it.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Well, I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. One of the questions that came in was, does the system handle duplicate documents? For example, what happens if two different people try to upload the same document?
Yeah,
Gary,
so,
can you talk about that?
Sure. I think Michael touched on it. We can probably drill down on so many different things in future webinars because there's a lot to really talk about. And we didn't talk about duplicate detection, mFiles, and actually I can show it. Let me leave this. Oops, sorry about that. So mFiles originally, or maybe not originally, but for a long time provided metadata duplication checking, where you could say, hey, if you add a document, it can't have the duplicate property set. And I think around a year ago, there was another feature added where not just metadata duplication, but actually inspecting the binary of the file and determining if it's a duplicate or not. And so there's a lot of like deduplication tools you can use on a file system, but mFiles has this basically built in. If I drag, let's see, I drag one of these over. If I drag the same one over again, mFiles is going to warn me, hey, there's already an existing document, right? And it doesn't prevent you from creating it. If you do, actually, I'm going to go ahead and create it because I want to show you something else. But it does warn you. And so this is something you wouldn't necessarily get in a file system where people are copying files around. And then you're like, I don't know which one of these files is the right file. There's no version stack. There's a duplication of, everybody's labeled it important contract underscore V1, right? And you're like, oh gosh, I have no idea. And so I'm going to go ahead and create this one. I want to show one more feature. Notice even if you decide to override it and say, yeah, I want to go ahead and add this, it does actually tell you, hey, there is another file in the repository somewhere that is exactly the same binary. This is cool. And Michael, was a year ago, right? I think I added this.
Yeah, it was about a year ago, right around the time that we started investing in the AI, because I think that's what really powers it, is reading the contents of the document. So even if that document had a different file name, it wouldn't really matter. It's really looking at, what's in the document, which is pretty unique. And there's usually a threshold of learning. So what it'll do is it'll look for something that's higher than 90%. And I think you can modify that threshold of kind of raising the bar if you find that it's surfacing documents that are alike but not duplicates. So you can kind of play around with that threshold of what that accuracy level is, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Super cool. All right, thanks, Gary. Another question that came in, I think this is probably a very simple one, but they wanted to know, does mFiles support single sign-on?
Yeah, and I didn't show it today on my demo. My demo environment, so like no mirrors or anything. It's a true sandbox, so I'm using just an internal mFiles login, but integration with Azure AD and SSO is supported, and so it's definitely something we would do in a production environment with a client that's using Active Directory.
Okay, awesome. Well, and that's it. I think we're just about out of time. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Michael, for all of your help and expertise. This has been a very quick overview of this integration. If you're interested in learning more about either this integration or mFiles, definitely please reach out, and we thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.